And the U.S. government is collecting data on healthcare workers providing gender-affirming care, and there is some debate over if this includes healthcare workers in Canada. Our correspondent Adam Zivo reports.
In mid-April, the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services launched an online Snitch line where people can report healthcare workers who provide pediatric gender-affirming care. The online Snitch line seems to be a product of U.S. President Donald Trump's recent executive order titled Protecting Children from Chemical and Surgical Mutilation. For clarification, pediatric gender-affirming care refers to the practice of giving minors puberty blockers, cross-sex hormones, or sex reassignment surgeries. One thing that needs to be emphasized here is that the Snitch line only applies to American healthcare workers operating in the United States. There was some confusion initially because some technical issues included Canadian provinces and postal codes. However, it was later clarified that this was a technical error. Unfortunately, the Tyee, a Canadian progressive publication, ran with the angle that Canadian healthcare workers are now vulnerable, despite the fact that their own interviews suggested that this is not the case. In the process of reporting on this story, the Tyee reached out to the BC Health Minister, who said that any attempts to target clinicians who provide pediatric gender-affirming care is reprehensible. However, the provincial minister's position is questionable given that there is increasing evidence that pediatric gender-affirming care is unscientific and highly risky. Over the past few years, there have been a number of systematic reviews that have been published by Finland, Sweden, England, and Canada, which have consistently found that the evidence base supporting pediatric gender-affirming care is of very low quality. These systematic reviews have consistently found that, contrary to what is claimed by trans activists and their allies, puberty blockers do not give youth time to think and are not truly reversible and tend to actually lock youth into a transgender identity. Additionally, cross-sex hormones carry considerable risks, including osteoporosis and sterilization. Sex reassignment surgeries also carry a significant amount of risk, mostly pertaining to sexual dysfunction. These systematic reviews have found that youth who self-identify as transgender often don't actually seem to be so and are using the transgender identity as a coping mechanism to deal with trauma. For example, you have young girls who have been sexually assaulted who then abruptly begin to identify as male shortly afterwards. You have youth who are just experiencing regular gender dysphoria, which for the most part resolves and doesn't require irreversible medical interventions to fix. Many of these young patients who are self-identifying as transgender also seem to be simply gay or bisexual, and it appears that they are struggling with deeply internalized homophobia and would prefer to be seen as transgender and straight rather than cisgender and gay. On top of that, youth who self-identify as transgender now often have significant mental health comorbidities, such as autism, which is a trend that was not seen until recently. This is something that only became a significant issue in the 2010s. Historically, there has been a very clear patient profile of youth who identify as transgender. Up until the 2010s, these were youth who were predominantly born as males, who showed significant gender dysphoria since a very early age, and were very consistent in their transgender self-identification, and they had no concurrent mental health comorbidities for the most part. They were mentally stable. So you would have these young kids who were quite obviously very femme, since the age of 3 or 4, and by the time they reach the age of 13, 14, it's pretty obvious that they're transgender or to some extent. In contrast, starting from the 2010s, you saw the rise, you saw an explosion of youth who began to abruptly self-identify as transgender starting from the age of 13 or 14, often alongside their friends, despite having no history of gender dysphoria. And these patients often had significant trauma or other mental health issues. Given the contentiousness of pediatric gender care, the high stakes involved, and the lack of clear evidence that providing such care is actually beneficial, several European countries have pivoted towards a more conservative approach that focuses on psychotherapy, where young patients are encouraged to talk about their mental health and their gender dysphoria and explore their gender identities, rather than rushing them to medicalized interventions. Unfortunately, in response, trans activists and allied healthcare workers have flouted the law in some of these European countries and have tried to provide this care illegally, for example, through smuggling in hormones via mail and then administrating them to youth without any real medical supervision. One imagines that this was one of the motivating factors for the launch of this new Snitch line. In Canada, there is no need for a snitch line because Canada is an outlier in the world when it comes to gender-affirming care and takes a very progressive approach. Health Canada follows the standards of care provided by the Rural Professional Association for Transgender Health, also known as WPATH. However, WPATH has been repeatedly criticized as an activist group masquerading as a health authority. And in recent years, it has been discovered that they have suppressed evidence that is critical of pediatric gender-affirming care and arguably politicize their health recommendations.